Imagine being torn from your home. But instead of shackles and filth, you are given silks, wine, and access to the man who rules the world. You are not a slave in the conventional sense. You are a puer delicatus, a pampered boy, a living jewel. But this luxury comes at a price. In this video, we will uncover the brutal truth of how to survive in a gilded cage and the one psychological trick that allowed them to stay sane. Because for all the luxury, in the eyes of the law, you remained an instrumentum vocale, a talking tool, a thing. And the very trick we will reveal can be called the Epictetus Protocol, named after the slave who became a great philosopher, who found a way to be free even in chains. This market of souls broke every mold. Its clients were not only children captured in war, they could be the sons of Rome's noble enemies, educated Greeks, or talented youth sold by their own impoverished families. Their value lay not only in their beauty, but in their intellect, education, and talent for music or poetry. They were a living status symbol, like a thoroughbred stallion or a rare Greek vase. This trade was handled by special merchants, the mangones. They would cultivate this living merchandise, teaching them to quote Homer and maintain perfect posture, anything to increase their price tenfold. This was not just a slave market, it was an art auction where the lot was a human being. Their world was one of intrigue. When you have no rights, your only weapon is your mind, and their main asset, youth, was inevitably fleeting. This last fact was the cruelest. The Romans even invented a word for it, one as cold as a blade. Exolitus, a favorite whose term has expired. The selection process was the first ordeal. This wasn't a market, it was a casting call. A potential master evaluated more than just appearance. He looked for wit, refined manners, the absence of a servile, vacant gaze. The first victory was being chosen. The first tragedy was realizing you are merely the most exquisite piece of merchandise. The poet Martial sarcastically described how buyers would prod flesh, check teeth, and force them to speak to assess the musicality of their voice, as if choosing an expensive lyre, not a person. Humiliation wasn't a side effect, it was built into the very process of the transaction. Once in the household, their days were filled with things a plebeian could only dream of: luxurious baths, exquisite feasts, expensive fabrics. But every morning, they awoke with a single thought. You are a thing. You can be sold, given away, or killed on a whim. Your no does not exist. Roman law granted the master absolute power over his household, patria potestas. This included the power of life and death. You were the world's most expensive work of art, which the master could smash against a wall at any moment, without any consequences. Their role was more complex than it seems. Yes, sexual services were the foundation, but they were also personal assistants, readers, and secretaries. They had to entertain, soothe, and be the perfect companion. This required immense emotional intelligence and self-control. They combined the roles of a literary connoisseur, a psychotherapist, and a perfect listener. For a moment, put yourself in their place. What is more terrifying, a physical threat or the need to wear a mask around the clock, suppressing your own personality? The first is pain for the body. The second is a slow death for the soul. Psychologists today would call this the systematic erasure of the self. This is not just an attack, it is a systemic deletion of your I, replacing your internal code with one that pleases the master. The master was the source of both pain and pleasure. He was the only one on whom their life depended. This created a complex, toxic attachment. The youth might begin to genuinely care for his tormentor, as his well-being was directly tied to the master's mood. To protect itself from constant stress, the brain forces you to love the source of the threat. After all, if your jailer is the only one who feeds you, you begin to thank him for the food, forgetting about the bars. They learned to read the slightest shifts in the master's mood, to anticipate his desires. But there was one person in the house whose hatred was impossible to predict. And it was deadly. Unlike the master, this person saw no value in them, only a threat. And this person possessed something they would never have: legal status. This person was the master's legal wife, the matrona. To her, You were not just a rival for her husband's attention. You were a living insult, a walking threat to her status, her influence, and most importantly, the inheritance of her children. In a world where marriage, matrimonium, was primarily a contract for producing heirs, you were a glitch in the system, a cuckoo in the eagle's nest, devouring resources meant for her offspring. Her war was not fought on a battlefield. Her weapons were whispers in the corridors, poison in the wine, a false accusation. She could not order you killed openly, but she could bribe another slave to accidentally break an expensive vase and pin the blame on you. She could spread a rumor of your infidelity to the master, which would send him into a rage. The home became a minefield where your every step could be your last. But let's look at it from her perspective for a second. She lives in a system where her sole function is to produce legitimate heirs. Her husband openly lavishes emotions and enormous sums of money on a living toy. For her, this isn't just jealousy, it's a desperate defense of her territory. From her point of view, she is the CEO of the family corporation, and you are an expensive, unsanctioned project draining the budget and yielding no legitimate profit in the form of children. Her cruelty is simply corporate asset protection. But the matrona was just the tip of the iceberg. The circle of enemies was wider. Other slaves, who had fought for years for the master's favor, saw you as an upstart, an arrogant outsider who had taken the warmest spot. Their envy could be just as lethal. To survive in this snake pit meant finding allies, perhaps the villa manager, the villicus, or the master's personal bodyguard. But any friendship was a risk. Today he is your ally, tomorrow he will sell you out for a few coins. In this silent war for survival, where you had neither sword nor shield, you had to use weapons that could not be seen. Intellect, observation, the ability to read people. The most skilled players did not become warriors. They became spies and psychologists. Their main weapon was forged not in a smithy, but in the silence of the master's chambers, from overheard conversations and stolen glances. This knowledge was their first and foremost weapon. They were present at business deals, secret meetings, and in private chambers. They heard everything: the secrets of senators, the weaknesses of rivals, the fears of the master himself. This information was their only real capital. They became a living cloud server of Rome's most compromising data. A well-timed piece of advice, a warning about a conspiracy, all of this transformed a living toy into a valuable asset. Some, like the Freedman Palace under Emperor Claudius, used this capital to become some of the richest men in the empire after their release. The second weapon was more subtle. Its goal was to transform from a luxury item into a necessity. They studied the master's habits down to the most microscopic details. They became the only one who could calm him, amuse him, or understand him without words. It was a fine line between service and manipulation. The task was to become not just a habit for the master, but a kind of drug. They created rituals of comfort. Only he knew how to properly mix the wine. Only he could guess which scroll to offer for reading. In his absence, the master would experience genuine withdrawal. This was no longer a service. It was a biochemical bond. Let's call this the scale of influence. At 0 is the instrumentum, the talking tool, complete submission, and the risk of being discarded at any moment. At 10 is the secret advisor, immense power, but also a deadly risk, a target on your back. Most tried to balance themselves at a 5 or 6, to become a service indispensabilis, the indispensable servant, useful enough to be valued, but not so influential as to be seen as a threat. It was a daily, hourly calibration of one's value. The third weapon was the most counterintuitive. Sometimes it was necessary to appear weak, vulnerable, completely devoted. This lulled the vigilance of enemies in the household and reinforced the master's sense of absolute power and control. By demonstrating complete dependence, they actually gained more freedom of action, because they were no longer perceived as a threat. This is pure stoicism in action, the philosophy professed by the former slave Epictetus: appear as nothing to become something. They honed these skills for years, becoming masters of applied psychology. But even the most skilled player could not defeat an enemy that was built into their very nature, an enemy that does not sleep, eat, or negotiate, an enemy whose name was Chronos. For them, time had a concrete physical manifestation, the first barely perceptible fuzz on the cheek, the lanugo. For them, this was not a sign of growing up. It was a death sentence for their status. Their panic and fear of aging didn't begin at 40, but at 18. It's like being an Olympic gymnast whose career burns out at 19, only instead of a pension, you face oblivion, or something far worse. The future held only 3 possibilities. The worst-case scenario was being sold to the quarries, ad metalla, a slow execution under the scorching sun, or to a gladiatorial school, a ludus, where your life is measured by the applause of the crowd. The middle path was formal freedom, manumisio, but this was the freedom of a pet canary released into a winter forest, without money, without real-world skills, and with the brand of exolitis on their forehead, which hindered them from finding work or marrying. The best outcome was as rare as a pearl in the desert. A master, moved by affection, would grant freedom, a fortune, and might even fictitiously adopt them to pass on part of his inheritance. But even the worst physical fate was not as terrifying as what was happening inside. Imagine, your entire personality has been programmed for years to suit one person. When he loses interest, a system failure occurs. You don't know who you are without him. This isn't just being fired. It's what today would be called identity annihilation. The ultimate form of gaslighting, where you are first made into everything and then into nothing. This life cycle seemed unbreakable. You are a beautiful thing until you grow old. But history knows one case, one glitch in the matrix that breaks this rule so radically it transcends history and enters the realm of myth. His name was Antinous. His master was not just a senator, but the Emperor Hadrian, an intellectual, a Hellenophile, nicknamed the Greekling, behind his back. Their bond was not a secret hidden behind palace walls. Hadrian displayed it to the entire world. He took the young man on inspection tours across the empire, from misty Britain to scorching Egypt. This was not just a whim. It was an attempt to recreate the Greek ideal of a relationship between a man and a youth on Roman soil. And then in Egypt, Antinous drowned in the Nile under circumstances that are still debated today. Hadrian's grief was boundless, but he did something no emperor before him had dared to do. He deified his lover. On the spot where the youth died, he founded an entire city, Antinopolis. Across the empire, from Africa to Greece, temples began to be built in honor of the new god, the god Antinous. This was not merely an expression of grief. It was an act of absolute power that literally broke reality. A slave boy became an official deity in the Roman pantheon. This was the ultimate system hack. But for every one Antinous, there were tens of thousands of nameless others whose stories ended in a quarry or an unmarked grave. His story is a winning lottery ticket, shouted from the rooftops, making us forget the millions who lost. More statues of Antinous have survived to this day than of most Roman emperors. His face became one of the most recognizable of antiquity. But that face is a shining anomaly that only illuminates more brightly the abyss that consumed all the others. To avoid falling into that abyss, there was an unwritten code of survival. Let's summarize its 3 main protocols. Protocol number 1, the spies' rule. Information was their only real currency. They absorbed secrets, weaknesses, and fears, turning the vulnerability of their position into a lever of influence. Protocol number 2, the psychologist's rule. They became an emotional anchor, indispensable not to the master's body but to his peace of mind, creating a bond that could not simply be bought on the market. And protocol number 3, the illusionist's rule. They masterfully managed perception. To their master, they were a pillar of support. To their enemies, a harmless, almost invisible shadow. So who were these people in the end? Tragic, broken victims of a ruthless system? Or masterful psychological players who used the only arsenal available to them to survive? Were they broken violins in the hands of fate, or virtuosos playing on the only string available to them? Write just one word in the comments that you think best describes their essence, victims, or players. Let's see which view of this brutal reality prevails.